Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LAOT podcast. I'm Arnav Mathur, and today we are at the epicenter of what may be one of the most consequential constitutional moments in India's recent democratic history. This is a moment that involves three things all at once. First is the women's representation in parliament. Second, the long deferred question of whether India's constituencies actually reflect who lives in them. And lastly, a more fundamental anxiety about whether states in the South are being written off from national politics. Here's what has happened so far. On April 14th, the government circulated three draft bills for a special session of the parliament. First was the constitutional 131st Amendment Bill. This was the anchor of the package, which sought to increase the maximum strength of Lok Sabha from 543 seats currently to 850 seats. It sought to revise the constitutional framework for delimitation, operationalize women's reservation. And the second bill that was introduced was the Delimitation Bill of 2026, which would constitute a new delimitation commission and instruct it to use the 2011 census as the basis for redrawing constituencies. The third bill was just a Union Territories Amendment Bill, which would align the legislative framework of the Union Territories with this idea. On April 17th, the constitutional amendment was put to vote. The bill failed to reach two-thirds majority of those present in voting and was defeated 298 to 230. Now, this was the first time in 36 years that a bill was defeated on the floor of Lok Sabha, the previous one being the 64th Amendment in 1990. Now, the very next day, in an address to the nation, Prime Minister Narendra Modi apologized to the women of India and accused the opposition of committing what he called Brun Hatya, or a female genocide, a female feticide of women's rights. The opposition has maintained that it never opposed women's reservation in principle. What it opposed was the government's decision to bundle reservation with delimitation. Now, today, to unpack what this legislative package actually contained, why it failed, and where it leaves the country, we are joined by Mr. Alok Prasanna. Alok is the co-founder of Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. He is, of course, our alum from Nalsar University, batch of 2008, and he obtained a BCL from University of Oxford in 2009. Now, he's written extensively about the delimitation debate, and if there's anyone equipped enough to help us understand this issue, it is him. So, Alok, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Arnav. It's my pleasure to be on the LAOT podcast.
Thank you. So, Alok, the bills are gone. The constitutional amendment was voted down. And the government has also withdrawn the delimitation bill. And yet, here we are talking about it. So, I have two preliminary questions to begin this conversation. First is, what exactly did this legislative package seek to do? What did it contain? And second, does its failure make this entire conversation redundant?
The second one I'll answer first. Of course not. And it leads into actually answering the first question, which is that delimitation is a pressing need in India. And it has nothing to do with women's reservations. Delimitation should take place, period. There was a fundamental mistake made in 1976 when the 42nd Amendment froze delimitation to be used, to be based only on the 1971 census. And when there was an opportunity to undo that, they froze it for 30 years. To undo that in 2006, the choice was not made. Although they updated the constituency boundaries 2001 census, the fact is the interstate distribution of states in the Lok Sabha was still based on the 1971 census. According to me, that was a catastrophic mistake. And that was a catastrophic mistake because it's not about the mathematics. It is not about power. It is fundamentally about democracy. Democracy means one person has one vote, and that one vote has an equal value. Specifically because we are talking about a kind of parliamentary democracy where the executive is answerable to the parliament, as opposed to, say, a presidential form of democracy, where in the US, where everyone directly votes the president, where it isn't as important, but depending on the design, it can have more or less of an impact. Be that as it may, I think what was done in 1976 and compounded later in 2006, I think should not have been done. I think should have sort of, rather 2003, should not have been compounded, gotten to the FF stage where it is right now, where if you look at the numbers and others have done the mathematics of it, Milan Vaishnav has this report, and I'm sure you'll link this in the podcast notes, where I think the misrepresentation of certain states has gone beyond all bounds of reasonable. It's okay if one state has 1 or 2 seats more and another state has 1 or 2 seats less in proportion to the population. But a state like Tamil Nadu has nearly 10 seats more than it should have. A state like Uttar Pradesh has about 11 seats fewer than it ought to have, and likewise Bihar. So this is a problem and this is a crisis. The problem is, and as I always say this, that the delimitation was absolutely necessary, should have been done. Unfortunately, the way it was attempted to be done through the 131st Amendment Bill and the consequent delimitation bills was absolutely the wrong way to go about it. The reason is because, number one, do the delimitation and say we don't care. All right? Say we actually don't care if Tamil Nadu gains seats or loses seats or Uttar Pradesh gains seats. We will go by the census. Two, if you're going to go by the census, why not just wait for 2 years? 2 years is not that long, right? You've had this problem accumulating for 40 years. You are in the process of conducting the census. The census data will be out in 2028. Constitute a delimitation commission after that and say use the latest census data, right? And in which case you have at least set right the process. You have made sure that the delimitation order is based on the latest census data and actually reflects reality rather than 2011. 2011 might seem recent to a lot of older listeners, but 2011 was 16 years ago. By the time the delimitation is done, it will be 18 years ago. So, and that India has changed dramatically in those 18 years, and specifically in the context of demographics. You have seen large-scale movement of people. Just to take the example of where I'm living and where I'm thinking from, in Bangalore, Bangalore's population has nearly doubled in these last 18 years. Which means Bangalore's misallocation of seats is going to remain, or rather, Bangalore is going to continue to remain underrepresented. It's not just Bangalore. We've seen that there are a few urban hubs where populations have increased dramatically. We've also seen that there have been near population collapses in a lot of rural areas. You are seeing this to some extent in the cleaning up of the electoral rolls. You find, just to take again for Bangalore's example, there are areas of Bangalore now where in 2006 they had 2 lakh voters. That number has dropped to less than 1.5. Simply because areas have become more commercial, because people have moved out. And there are parts of Bangalore which had little more than 2 lakh in 2006, which now have something like 6 lakhs. That's triple, right? So this creates a huge problem. And the huge problem is notwithstanding the failure or success of this bill, right? The problem is the bill itself. It tried to address the issue of delimitation. And I'm saying this very clearly. It need not have been linked to women's reservation. There is nothing which says that women's reservation should have taken place only after a delimitation. It's a somewhat cynical approach to it. The idea is that we will give women a share in power as long as it does not upset any existing power equations or balances. And we will postpone it to delimitation once the delimitation exercise gets carried out, which effectively postpones it till a whole other set of issues are addressed, right? Meaning that the focus will not be so much on women's reservation, it will be on resolving 10 other issues, and women's reservation will be one. Again, there is a very simple solution to it. If the government was genuine about saying we want women's reservation before 2029, simply remove the link between delimitation and women's reservation. Simply say that the election commission will randomly pick through lottery process, through whatever else it is, the number of constituencies where women can contest upon, and it will change every election cycle, whatever else it is. You can do it there's nothing which says that you have to add a certain number of seats, right, in order for women to get appropriate political representation. Just increase the number. There are many good ways to do it. The bad way to do it was to link it to delimitation, which is essentially meant that people would say, hang on, you can solve the problem of delimitation, but there are 3 or 4 other things to be taken into account. And those are not trivial things to be taken into account. Let me be very clear. As much as I say that delimitation is absolutely necessary, concerns about representation of southern states, of other smaller states are just as important. The Constitution also recognizes this. We have the
Yeah.
principle in the Constitution that the general principle that states will be allotted the number of seats in proportion to their population does not apply to states which have a population of less than 6 million. It
Right.
is a constitutional acknowledgement that a Ladakh perhaps cannot be lumped in with the rest of Jammu and Kashmir, let alone the rest of India. That a Sikkim is sufficiently distinct from the rest of North Bengal that it should not have to be lumped in with the rest of them for having, even it has such a tiny population. So I think we have to acknowledge that these are valid concerns.
Yeah.
And to address these valid concerns, what is needed is perhaps a larger federal rebalance. Let me put it there. I won't get into that now itself. But just to answer to your questions, what the bill tried to do was essentially delimitation. It had nothing to do with women's reservation. What it did was, in a very bad way, it tried to use 2011 data. It did not address the core idea that states should be represented in proportion to their population. It seemed to be coming from a pretty cynical place where it was saying that to delimitation or the women's reservation gets it. If you have seen that famous cartoon of by this magazine or this dog gets it, right? It seemed like that. And I think there was an opportunity to reimagine delimitation which was missed. So I don't think it's I don't think it's a bad thing that the constitutional amendment bill failed, but I do think it is unfortunate that it has impeded more discussion on this extraordinarily important issue for the future of India's democracy. And that is where I think this kind of discussion like this is necessary, even though that bill was.
Understood. Right. So you've mentioned a lot of points, starting from the history of the freeze of the delimitation, why it is important, why does the representation of different states with different population matters, and of course the women's reservation issue itself. We'll unpack all of these concepts throughout the podcast, but I want to dive deeper into the questions of women's reservation because that seems to be the smokescreen and the political rhetoric that has been going around, saying that anyone who opposed this bill was essentially anti-women reservation. Now, when the Nari Shakti Vandan Adhiniyam was brought in 2023, as a design feature, was it linked to delimitation? Is my broader question. Was that the understanding? And the second point is that, the second thing that I think you mentioned, which is important to understand, is that the reason why it's being pitched as first an increase in the seats and then women's reservation is essentially so that any sitting male MP does not lose his seat in favor of a woman. It's essentially so that the dudes in the parliament know that they have a seat and we can bring in more women if we want to. But we won't risk our seats being lost for them. Is that the understanding?
It seems to be that. Like I said, there's a certain level of cynicism which proposes an increase in the number of seats, which allows of course, there's the architectural element of it, which allowed for the size of the parliament we want. Let me be very clear. I think it's a good idea that parliament should have 850 members. And I say this because I think India is perhaps one of the few countries where an MP represents 2 to 3 million people almost. That is a crazy number. That is the population of more than the population of a lot of countries in this world. And yes, of course, there are levels of government below that. But in the national parliament, I think it's generally not a good idea to have that few MPs because then the link gets cut off. Then essentially as an MP, you need only a very small section of people to come out and vote for you. And you can pretty much ignore the rest. And you are basically not seriously representing anyone anymore. There is no ability for people to put up sustained pressure on an MP. An MP can literally go against it. It's hypothetical, but you know what I mean. An MP can go against the wishes of about 1/3 of the people, 1 million people in their constituents, and no one they can't do anything about it. Nobody actually does that, but that's one of the worries. There is a sort of rule of thumb which kind of tries to arrive at what would be a good number for parliaments to have. And that number is like the cube root of the population of a country. Right? Again, it's not like a mathematical formula that if you have more than this, it's good, or if you have less than this, it's bad. It is just an indication that if you see around the world, the more democratic a country is, the more that their parliament size is a reflection of this formula. And if you apply this formula to India, then approximate number that comes to is about 950 or 1,000. So 850 is not a bad number. Let me first clarify that. I think the objection that it involves more expenses is utterly silly. I think India, I maintain this, that India does not have the size of government that it actually needs for a country of 1.5 billion people, for an economy of this size. It doesn't have this many, doesn't have as many representatives, bureaucrats, officers, whoever else it doesn't have. So that argument does not really stand, if you honestly ask me. But I do think smaller constituencies are better. You will see that generally the turnout is better in smaller constituencies as opposed to larger constituencies. So the correlation is very clear. And if we want better turnout, we want greater political participation. There is also the possibility that it will unleash political forces that are currently now struggling to find space given the size of the constituency. Again, that's a hypothetical, that's a future. We're allowing for the possibility. We don't know what it could be, but I'm saying it's a good thing to do. There's no problem with increasing the number to 850. But it is being done in the most cynical way possible, which is to say that we want to increase it only so that we can accommodate somewhere. Women's representation was never about please accommodate us. In fact, if we go back to the history of the Constituent Assembly debates, the only group of people who say we absolutely do not want reservation, and there is not even a debate about it, are the women. Women are united in one voice in the Constituent Assembly to say we don't want reservation. If you go even further back, there was reservation for women in the Government of India Act. And there, the opinions among Indian women who deposed before Parliament in the UK and all other commissions was a little bit divided. But by the time of independence, this division becomes almost non-existent. It becomes almost uniform, right? And I've written about this in some articles. You can share that. It's basically a reflection of the increasing confidence that the women's movement, the nascent women's movement, has in India about political participation. To say that we think we can stand on an equal footing with men and win elections. If we as women, even though we are only about 16 or so in this particular Constituent Assembly, we are making our voices heard. We are extraordinarily organized and coherent about what we want, making sure that our constitution is gender neutral. On day one, India's constitution extends universal suffrage. Most of the so-called developed democratic countries did not do that. On day one, India's constitution protects equal rights for all genders, right? Again, in a way that most other constitutions did not. So in a way, they felt if we have gotten all these things through our ability to organize and put pressure and so on, surely we should be able to do that in a democratic system. In one sense, they were proven wrong, right? It's not as if they were dumb or didn't know what they were doing. They believed that they would get support from men, not on the basis of their gender or anything else, but because of the content of their ideas, abilities, and so on. But it turned out India was far more entrenched, patriarchally intense than they had imagined, which made it even more difficult. I mean, just to give you an example, if you read Ornit Shani's book on how India became democratic, one of the problems that in preparing the first electoral rolls is that a lot of women across North India did not even give their names. They refused to give their names. They said, I am mother of so-and-so, wife of so-and-so, daughter of so-and-so. Because it was like, how can I give a stranger my name? Right? It was unthinkable for them to give a stranger their name. And the choice for the Election Commission was either we disenfranchise all these women or we somewhat succumb to this patriarchal norm and say, well, all right, yeah, at least it's easier for you. We'd rather have you vote than rather have you not vote. So let's accept this and list these people down as mother of so-and-so, sister, wife of so-and-so, and so on and so on. But by the third election commission said nothing to it. All right? We are going to insist that you give us your name. Immediately there is a drop, but the next election, people see the value of voting. So they challenge that patriarchal norm, and that patriarchal norm slowly goes away. And of course, in today's Aadhaar cards, nobody's saying, no, in today's PAN cards, nobody's saying, wife of so-and-so, mother of so-and-so, everyone's giving their name along with their religion, right? So these are deeply entrenched social norms which are not easy to break, but it can be broken if an effort was made. So women's participation in politics runs into this deeply entrenched patriarchal norm, right? Then the idea that women can choose on their own is something that we have only been seeing in the last 2 or 3 decades. Women didn't even turn out to vote, right? It's only in the last couple of election cycles that we're seeing that women are slowly, becoming more frequent and regular and independent voters compared to men. These are long-term changes. But what has also meant that nobody has challenged this head on, don't challenge this head on, right? to say that we have to break this. First effort was made in panchayats and municipalities, where 33% and in some states now 50% reservation is agreed. That has worked to a certain degree, right? We all know that you've seen the TV show Panchayat. We have seen, and I think it does a good job of showing how women are essentially put up as just the face where the whole panchayat is being run by their husband, right? And you have this phenomenon happening across the country. But even the show sort of shows how the woman sarpanch takes charge slowly, bit by bit. In some cases, she's pushed into, in some cases, she finds her own motivation, whatever else it is. So it's a quiet revolution that's happening.
Some agency to herself.
Yes, exactly. So
Yeah.
we sort of see, so the idea is that perhaps this is the measure that is needed. You cannot just let it say, hey, it's open for everyone. Why aren't women coming through? Why aren't women being represented in accordance with their population? And which
Yeah.
is why you introduced 33%. Now, I, for the life of me, have not been able to figure out why 33% was the number chosen. Maybe someone decided at some point it is just stuck there. 50% is 50%, right? We give reservations to scheduled castes, scheduled tribes on the basis of their population, right? So why not women? Anyway, that's a different call. That's a different discussion to be had. But whatever else it is, the larger goal here is that we need to take active measures to increase women's participation in politics. And that increased representation is not just about accommodating them as charity. It is about challenging this patriarchal norm. And that patriarchal norm is supposed to unsettle people. Right? The fact that women are going out on their own and voting has unsettled a lot of people. It has challenged norms. Women becoming sarpanches, mayors, corporation council members, and so on has unsettled people. So to say that we will do women's reservation, but as some sort of charity where they will get their seats, as long as they don't expect to seriously challenge existing incumbents, I think is fundamentally cynical in the approach that it takes to women's reservation, right? So you want women to have some share in power as long as it doesn't affect your share in power. How can that be? Right? You are in some ways being cynical about the whole process. So, which is where I think the Nari Shakti Niyam for whatever benefits that it did, I think the fact that it's supposed to come after delimitation and that we will increase the number of seats and then give women reservation, I feel is fundamentally cynical in this way. That it pretends to offer charity as right. Right? And there's a difference between something being offered as charity and something being offered as a right. So I think in that sense, the women's reservation can be done literally tomorrow. Right? All it takes is removing the link between women's reservation and delimitation. To say that next Election Commission of India will randomly select 1/3 of constituencies where only women candidates, and that's the process just followed even in panchayat and corporation elections. We will announce which constituencies. Thank you for your service, male MLAs. Right? If you are so keen, maybe you can try if you want to put some female relative and to fight in the process, but you would rather have that female relative of yours sitting in the MLA, sitting in MP, and so on. I mean, the other great show, again, I'm using works of fiction because they tend to reflect reality better than most case studies and so on.
Yeah.
You have the show Maharani, which is very loosely based on Rabdi Devi becoming Chief Minister of West Bengal. And to me, what really resonated in that show is that it makes no bones about the fact that she was put up as a dummy candidate. She was put up as a dummy CM for the Chief Minister who was facing a criminal case to control the power from behind. But guess what? Rabdi Devi proved to be a politician in her own right. She grew into the office. She understood what it requires. And Maharani, the show, kind of tracks this in obviously fictional ways. But in some sense, I think the radical idea that this show, and likewise to a lesser extent Panchayat has, is that power changes people. We want, and if power changes people in sometimes bad ways, it can also change them in good ways. It can make them aware of their responsibilities. People grow into this positions and authority. And we want to give women that opportunity of growing their position of authority. Yes, they may get elected as the wife or daughter or sister or so and so, or so on and so on of somebody else. But over time, when this becomes like a kind of a norm, people will see that there is a demonstration effect that they grow into this authority. So I think to that extent, the idea that we necessarily need to link women's reservation to delimitation is completely untrue. Women's reservation can literally take place tomorrow if we want to really do it. It's just simply about amending and removing the link to delimitation.
Understood. I think one of the best parts was the understanding that women's reservation should be stopped to be looked at in terms of accommodation and more as a challenge to any sort of patriarchal norm and as a matter of right. And even if they come off initially as a dummy candidate or a dummy MP, over time the power will change, and even I think just the optics of having more female parliamentarians will change the way our Indian society works. So
Yeah.
linking delimitation and women's reservation is fundamentally a patriarchal understanding of how reservation should be given. You also
Yeah.
spoke about the philosophy of delimitation. Why do we need delimitation in the first place? But let's move on. Let's understand and break down delimitation systematically, where we talk about the past, present, and then the future. So, if someone's joining into this podcast not knowing about what delimitation as a word means, as a concept means, how would you try to explain what just the concept means?
Yeah. So we have a certain number of fixed MPs in our parliament. So who decides who will be an MP? It's the voters. It's not as if every person in this country decides on a list of 1,000 people which 500 people get MPs. You are an MP elected from a particular constituency. What are the boundaries of that constituency? Who are the people who vote in that constituency is essentially what delimitation is about. And delimitation essentially follows the principles laid out in Article 81 and 82 to ensure that every person who votes has same value for their vote, which means that your vote will have the same impact whether you're voting in Bombay, whether you're voting in Jharkhand, whether you're voting in Guwahati, or whether you're voting in Chennai, right? So, to do this, you need to be able to draw the lines on the map in a way. And again, this is as far as practicable. Nobody can ensure mathematical precision. That's not the expectation here.
Yeah.
As far as practicable, you want to ensure that every constituency is of the same size. But if you ask ChatGPT to do this, it'll just do a grid in India. You can't just have a grid. You can't just suddenly draw a grid because people of a constituency need to share something in common to be able to select an MP who will represent all their interests, right? The second limitation on this delimitation exercise is the fact that states exist in India, federalism is still a thing in India, and you can't have constituencies cutting across state boundaries. So you have to have constituencies which are within state boundaries. Now our states are divided into districts. You can't necessarily cut across district boundaries. In some instances, it's been done. Some instances, it's possible. But and of course, it has happened as a number of districts have increased. But you can't have randomly a half urban, half rural constituents. You try as much as possible that a coherent group of people are voting on the same issues, on the same concerns, sharing some sort of common set of issues they want their representative to address. Now, keep in mind that Lok Sabha constituencies are further subdivided into assembly constituencies, right? And so, as far as possible, you try to avoid one assembly constituency to sit between two different Lok Sabha constituencies. It has sometimes happened. There are some exceptional instances, but let's take that out of the picture. The larger principle is still this. How do you ensure that in electing your 543 Lok Sabha MPs or whatever that number is, every person's vote has the same value, right? Now, what does it mean to have the same value? It means the constituencies are approximately the same size, subject to them being within the same state and subject to them generally being in a coherent area. Now, you can sort of follow these principles and still find a way to tamper with it. And that is called gerrymandering, right? This is a term which, of course, comes from the United States. And it's the idea that you know where your supporters are. You want to maximize their impact on elections. So while ostensibly keeping the same number of people per constituency, you draw constituency boundaries in as strange and weird a way as possible so that your opponent will not be able to capitalize on their numbers and you will be able to over-capitalize on your numbers, right? So you can, I mean, there's a fun game that you can play which actually teaches you how this is done on the internet. You can check it out. But this is a problem. And to ensure that we don't have this problem in India, what we have generally had is a delimitation commission which has been as neutral as possible. Non-partisan is a better word, right? So the delimitation acts have generally been that a person who is a retired Supreme Court judge heads the commission. The election commissioner is a part of the process. And at each state level, state election commissioners are part of the process. And to make sure that local knowledge is taken into account, they co-opt MLAs and MPs of the locals of the state, though they're not voting members. So it's essentially the judge, retired judge, or the judge election commissioners who actually have a say in how delimitation report is prepared. On the basis of the delimitation report, an order is prepared, basically drawing these constituencies. The last exercise took place was in 2006, in time for elections in 2008 and 9 and so on. So in that sense, the idea is how do we draw the boundaries so that there are roughly equal number of people in each constituency within the boundaries of the states, in accordance with the larger proportion in principle that each state should have as many MPs as the proportion to their population. There is an important exception, which is, of course, that very small states, and India has necessarily some small states like Goa, Sikkim. You have now the Union Territory of Ladakh. You have Arunachal Pradesh and Meghalaya, which are very small, and like now, of course, Uttarakhand and Himachal, which should not be reduced to zero or should be crushed into another state for representation. So, which is why a different principle applies for them, or a different set of principles is used for them. And my larger reading of this is that this comes from an understanding that there is our constitution is not just one value, one principle. Our constitution is constantly trying to balance different principles. So the reason why smaller states tend to have representation more than their actual population is keeping in mind the principle of fraternity. Right? Everybody says federalism. Federalism is actually not the right answer. Federalism just has to do with division of powers at the state, at the government level. Which government gets to do what? Which government has power to do what? Is it staying in line within the constitutional mandate? That is federalism. Federalism in India existed before there were linguistic states. You had Madras Presidency, you had then became Madras State. Madras State was a combination of what is now Andhra and what is now Tamil Nadu with parts of Kerala and parts of Karnataka, right? You can't say that this was a nation state in any way. That was a later development. So we have to keep in mind that yes, India's federalism has evolved, but the constitutional design was that the demands of democracy will be tempered by the need for fraternity. Democracy just doesn't mean that you will only go by the will of the majority and the minority has no say. A lot of our constitution is about protecting this value of fraternity. And I would argue that this principle, right, this principle should also inform the way in which the larger federal setup is reimagined. Right? There is no constitutional requirement which says that a state should basically have disproportionate representation simply because it is rich, simply because it is unique, simply because it is perfect in some way. That's not the constitutional principle. The constitutional principle is fraternity. And this is something to be debated about and discussed about. But this debate and discussion should not happen on what I think are illegitimate ideas such as population growth or economic. I mean, not to say that these things are bad things. These things are not constitutional principles. Constitution doesn't require that you should punish states which haven't controlled their population. Right? That is essentially a toxic political rhetoric of the 70s infecting the way in which we operate our constitutional system. Or for that matter, that GDP should decide whether you should get more seats or less seats. All of that to me are not the way to run a constitutional system. Constitutional system should go by the basis of the constitutional values underpinning our constitution. So I would say that delimitation, in as much as it must promote democracy, must also take into account the needs of fraternity. How it does that, I don't think there is one exact specific answer to it. There are a bunch of good answers and there are a bunch of bad answers. And that we can get into in more detail. But very broadly, I want to lay out this context for our listeners that delimitation as an exercise is not a mathematical exercise. It's not simply about drawing random lines on the map. It is a complicated exercise. And unfortunately, our Delimitation Act does not give enough guidance on how boundaries should be drawn. Right? I mean, you can of course accuse the legislation of. I mean, no one can accuse the legislation of being too over deterministic, but I think there needs to be much greater guidance on how to ensure coherence that follow district boundaries, follow common, history, follow a bunch of other things that can be taken into account, geographic
Yeah.
similarities, and so on. So I think that there is scope for, I suppose, more fine-tuning of the Delimitation Act to take this into account, which is not done in the present legislation. But the larger point is that it's not just a mathematical exercise, it is actually a democratic exercise. It's actually a constitutional exercise, which requires you to take into account the principles of democracy, but perhaps also account for the needs of federalism.
Understood. Yeah, I think your answer really goes into how complicated this exercise is and why it's not a very clear-cut answer. Just the process that you explained of how the Delimitation Commission it functions, how it is set up, shows the amount of complications that goes into it. The risk of gerrymandering being one of the biggest political issues that can come up when you're fighting elections. And of course, balancing out values of democracy with fraternity is, of course, important. Now, you also mentioned, even in your initial answers, about the freeze that is taking place in our constitution. And my understanding of the history is that delimitation has been done about 4 times since independence, which was 52, 62, 72, and then 2002. The last exercise in 2008 was only to redraw the boundaries, but the number of seats did not change. And it has been frozen since the 71 census. So can you walk us through that particular history? Why did this freeze take place? What sort of political conditions made it acceptable or, let's say, necessary for this freeze to come into place?
So I think if you can go back even further, in fact, when Dr. Ambedkar identifies this in one of his writings, that
Yeah.
will the people of the South tolerate the domination of the North? And he frames it in that way as well. So it's not a post 1950 history alone. When thinking about a future India, he wonders which, let's say, peninsular India, that's South and North are fairly unclear terms. So let's say peninsular India, which includes every state south of Maharashtra and south, maybe excluding a bit of Orissa on the east. And you could say all the states on the Indo-Gangetic plain from Bengal, including, let's say, Rajasthan. To a broad set of things. Not to exclude the other states, but very broad ones. The idea being that, look, there is huge difference in this country. The differences accentuate the further you get away from Delhi. That you have, and it has all the North has always been more populous. Let us be very clear about that. It has to do with a whole range of, and you could not even say historical figure, it's actually geographical. It is geographical because the existence of the Himalayas is what creates the whole Indo-Gangetic plain, which is extraordinarily fertile, which is somehow which has always given scope for more people, more wealth, and therefore more powerful empires and kingdoms to base themselves in the north. And it's not just only India which has this geographical element to it. You see Italy also. It's not a strictly federal country in the sense that we understand it, but you have this disparity between north and south. Again, for the fact that the north is more fertile, more people, etc., and the south is less. So you do have regional differences within Italy as well, for some for similar reasons. So in that way, it is a fact. It is not as if somebody tried to engineer the north to become more populous or the south to become less populous. And it has also had different consequences. The history of this is quite tangled. The fact that you are you don't have to face the consequences of any hostile neighbor in the south, means that you don't have to invest that much money in defense infrastructure in the south. Can be mostly civilian infrastructure. The fact that you have access to the sea means that there are a number of harbors and access to trade generally correlates to better economic growth and development. Again, it's not as if somebody put South India in the sea like that. It is just a geographic feature. Then you could say there are more specific historical events, perhaps The South never faced the ravages of opium farming and colonial rule in the same way that the North did, right? And this is something which I don't think has been fully studied. I only became more aware of it when I read Amitav Ghosh's Smoke and Ashes, which goes into the opium trade. And it's I think we need to rewrite our history textbooks even more, because this British Empire is nothing more than, like the world's largest, most effective drug running racket, right? What poor Pablo Escobar did on a small scale for a few billions, these guys did for trillions in today's money. And they basically took down two of the world's most populated civilizations in the process, in India and in China.
Right.
So these things have long-term impacts. And the long-term impacts is not just the fact that something bad happened, but the way in which it fundamentally altered society. The fact that you could not trust your neighbor, the fact that there was an overweening presence of a surveillance state, which literally dictated what you could grow on your land, which destroyed the kind of agricultural basis and surplus and basis for cash crops across parts of North India. I think you cannot immediately dismiss. Then you also had the ravages of partition, which the South India did not face the consequences of, right? Both in the East, which we always forget, which was a long partition. It wasn't just one event in a year and everything was fine, which was in the East, and also in the West, right? You had a large-scale population transfer, large-scale destruction of communities, wealth, and so on. Yes, people picked themselves up and found ways to move on, but these are things which have long-term impact. So I don't think you can immediately say there was this one thing or that other thing, or we did better population control, or we are smarter or better. Anybody can say that. These are just facts to be taken into account. And the fact is, North India, broadly the Indo-Gangetic plain, and peninsular India have different population dynamics, have different histories, trajectories, economic opportunities, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The point of a constitution is, how do you get these very different regions to live together peacefully? Or rather, how do you get people in these regions to live together peacefully? Again, I'm only giving to, I'm not even including, say, the Northeast, which has its own set of dynamics, or the extreme North in Punjab, in Jammu and Kashmir and Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. India is an extraordinarily diverse country. Let's not just make this about North versus South. What our constitution is it is by far the most radical experiment to get a continent's worth of people to live together harmoniously in a democratic system and work for the betterment of everyone through this constitutional framework, right? And that is not about who is better or who is worse. That is about how do we keep the system going against all the pressures which threaten to break up the country itself, right? So I think what we should understand is generally that the history of this freeze on delimitation is an attempt to forget all of these problems and hope they go away. These have to be confronted head on. These have to be faced. In 1976, because the whole thrust was on family planning and the concerns of the South were manifesting, they were saying, hey, our population growth is slowing down, right? Whereas North India's population growth does not seem to be slowing down. You're seeing the benefits of the Green Revolution, fewer famines, fewer droughts. You're seeing the benefits of the spread of communications and healthcare, which is leading to longer lifespans. But people are saying, this is creating imbalances. Instead of finding ways to address the imbalances, what the 1970s, the 42nd Amendment essentially is, let's not look at it at all. Right? It was, I think, there are other people who can go into detail the historical context. But I think what we have to understand is that the choice that was made was the wrong one. The wrong choice was made, which essentially froze delimitation, which froze, or rather made us avoid dealing with these difficult questions, right? And pushing it, kicking the can for 25 years. And instead of addressing it in the 2000s, kicking the can further down the road. And now here we are.
Yeah.
Right? Here we are in 2026, still talking about why is the division of Lok Sabha seats dependent on 1971. So I think what really calls for us now is to say it was a mistake that was made in 1976. The 46th Amendment should not have done that. We should have faced the question, this hard question, head on, to see what kind of a constitutional framework will appropriately address concerns of, again, I go back to it is not federalism, it is fraternity. You want all sections of Indians to feel that they are part of India. And yes, it may involve making some concessions, it may involve making more concessions in favor of the others, but it is not about trying to show one say part of the country is better than the other parts.
Right.
So that conversation we have not had, which means we are stuck relitigating this pointless birth control discussion, where now these very same South Indian states are saying we want people to have more children. You want people to have more children. That's not going to happen anytime soon. But to go back to this, no, it is not a counter. It is just this patriarchal idea that you can somehow coax people into having more children because it suits your needs for whatever economic or other purposes, right? You have to create the circumstances for people to want to have children. You can't push and prod them into doing so. Anyway, we leave that aside. But the larger point that I sort of want to make is that the history of this decision, it has been justified with ex post facto reasoning to say, oh, they took the South's concerns into account, but it was a combination of things. But you can't necessarily justify it anymore. You couldn't justify it a few years afterward. Also, you can't justify it anymore because what you're doing is tampering with a very fundamental core democratic ideal of one person, one vote, one ballot. I think the history of the decision has, I think, caused a lot of damage. And I think it's time to reverse that and go back to the regular principle of regular delimitation. More seats, less seats, all of it will happen. All of which can be addressed. You have to create the space for this kind of democratic, constitutional bargaining, so to speak, where various values are kind of balanced, set off against each other, so that ultimately people still feel that it's worth preserving this constitution and going forward.
Yeah. I think it was really important for us to go into the history because the North-South divide has been very oversimplified, saying that, look, we can do better population control, you can't do, you are the Bimaru states. So that is why the freeze came into picture. But actually understanding the historical context of why this disparity exists is also really important. And you mentioned about how, the 71 kicking the can down the road happened. And now the same South's anxiety is saying that we lose seats if you do delimitation based on population alone. The same sort of argument was raised in the session itself. And the government gave an official but unenforceable answer. I call it unofficial but official but unenforceable because they said it at the floor of the parliament, but it was not reflected in the actual bill. They said that we will expand the Lok Sabha to 850 and each state will receive additional seats to the proportion of their current share. So 50% increase. And this was being pitched throughout the 3 days of the session. Now, do you think that this would be a permissible or a desirable solution where you just pro rata increase 50% of the current allocation of the states? Is that something that's viable?
It's not viable and it is not desirable. It is not viable for the reason that Article 81 Clause 2 requires you to give states the seats in proportion to their population. Right? And the baseline has been decided on the basis of 1971. The baseline has changed, which means that unless you say we will randomly create these numbers, there is no provision that allows you to do so, you cannot promise on the host. And that's what I've said, that's what I've written. You cannot promise an increase in 50%. Even if you could do it, I don't think it's a good idea because you are only perpetuating the inequities of freezing delimitation.
Yes.
You're no longer sort of following the one person, one vote, one value. You're tampering with it even more. You are saying that Tamil Nadu, which should actually only have X number of seats, gets a benefit just to get their MPs to vote for this, right? Which, again, is not really a constitutional way of doing. You're essentially saying that the freeze of 1971 continues, but in some random arbitrary way, we will increase the number of seats. Again, I don't think, to be quite honest, it's not a well thought out proposal. It is not something which had any realistic chance of taking place or succeeding. I think the opposition was justified in calling the bluff of the government to say it's not reflecting anything. We have no reason to believe you. We have no reason to take you seriously on this one. Uh, there are much better proposals. One which I personally feel is a realistic way of balancing concerns is to link delimitation to not population but to number of electors. That is, or even if you're not electors, if you say there are problem with electoral, if you say there are problem with electoral roles, you can just say adult population. Because your adult population is the one which is allowed to vote, and we have set that system. We have said anyone above 18 is allowed to vote. Whether you register to vote or not, we say adults, right? We let us say that adults are the ones because that accounts for the changes in population without causing too much of a shock in political representation. Now, if you go back to the calculation that someone like Milan Vishnav has done on the basis of 2026 figures, Tamil Nadu will lose like 11 seats. That's a huge shock, right? You don't want to create a shock to suggest that you've suddenly been rendered irrelevant. You may want to stick to the principle, but you may say that we will enforce this principle slowly over a period of time until it actually reflects reality. How do you do it? I would suggest one good way of doing it is to link it to adult population. Tamil Nadu has, in fact, almost as many, even though it has about 3.5 crore fewer people than Bihar, it has actually almost the same number of registered voters. I don't know if that number has changed because of SIR, but it's a comparable number because Tamil Nadu's population pyramid is very different. There are a lot more people living a lot longer in Tamil Nadu. The average life expectancy is much greater in Tamil Nadu. You have more people on the rolls and they're more likely to come out and vote than Bihar. So turnout sometimes in Tamil Nadu means that there are actually more people voting in Tamil Nadu than Bihar, even though Tamil Nadu actually has a much smaller population, right? By about 30-40%. So in some senses, you are saying that your value as a voter does not decrease. The principle is still upheld. One person, one vote, one value. All right. What we're only changing to a certain extent is, say, people cannot vote, which is children. This is a proposal that has been discussed in detail by some people, and my colleagues at Vidhi have gone into this in some detail. I would urge everyone to please look at what people at Vidhi have written about this. There's a publication on delimitation. But to me, this seems like a more workable solution that you address the concern that we are going too far away from one person, one vote, one value. But at the same time, fraternity requires you to account for the concerns of parts of the country which may feel they're going to be left out. The balance, I think, will be in saying that we will draw the constituency boundaries, keeping in mind adult population, and you still need a census for that.
Of course.
Once, to me, like you have the Hindi saying, right? Like, doodh ka doodh aur pani ka pani. I think too much of our discussion on delimitation is happening in the absence of hard, concrete numbers. We have proxies for it. We have good proxies for it in terms of Aadhaar data, in terms of registrar of births and deaths data. But at some level, we know there are problems with the way in which this data is collected. It is very aggregate. It is not going to be giving you specific, minute data that's as good census actually can give you. So let us actually carry out that census exercise properly, right? Yeah. It is a 1.5, 2 year exercise. Let that census exercise be done properly. Give us the data. Let us draw the constituency boundaries on the basis of that data, whether we take population or whether we take electors. All of that is a call to be made. All of that is a choice to be made. But I think we have to find a way to restore this principle of one person, one vote, one value into our constitutional system. Again, accounting for concerns of fraternity.
So. Right. And I think the proposal that you make is very interesting of linking seats to electors rather than the population itself. There are three other possibility of reforms that I wanted to get your thoughts on. The first is digressive proportionality. Now, this model is used in the European Parliament, where smaller member states are deliberately overrepresented to represent their status as distinct political communities. For example, Germany, with a population of 86 million, will have 96 seats, but a country like Malta with just 50,000 people will also have 6 seats. So it's overrepresented for the per capita people. Does that sort of model have any possibility of working in India?
I don't think so. For the reason that Indian states are not one-on-one analogs of EU member states. Those are all states that started as as nation states and came together to form the EU. And in some ways, the EU, as powerful as it is, constitutionally is not as powerful vis-a-vis member states as the Indian Union is vis-a-vis Indian states. So in that sense, it's not as if tomorrow Germany's boundaries can be redrawn, but Bihar's boundaries can be redrawn,
Yeah.
right? EU cannot redraw Germany's boundaries, but the Indians, the Union can redraw Bihar's boundaries. Separately, there is a good argument why we should have much smaller states. I think Bihar should be actually about 3 or 4 states, and UP should be about 6 states, and MP about 3 states. And again, these are not arbitrary numbers. These are based on the fact that, unlike with Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, where there's an actual where there's an actual state commission which looked at linguistic predominance, history, culture, and so on. Nobody has drawn those boundaries for Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, or for that matter, Madhya Pradesh or Rajasthan. In fact, there are lots of, I would say, and I'm sure people who are in the know can say this, there are states which are worth carving out from both UP and Bihar. Right? This Purvanchali culture actually is across UP and Bihar. Bundelkhand is historically across Madhya Pradesh and what is now Uttar Pradesh. So there may, I mean, we've seen that happen in the context of hilly and tribal areas in the Bihar and Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh. But I think for better governance and administration, we probably need you need much smaller states. There's an argument maybe for Maharashtra as well to be split up into 2 states. Again, all of those are discussions worth having. But I don't think the EU's model will particularly help India for the reason that Indian states are not nation states. Their boundaries can be redrawn, can be changed, can be modified at any point of time. So I don't think the same logic will apply. And unlike the European Union, the Indian Union is not trying to expand. The European Union has to constantly make an argument why it should exist, right? And it has to get smaller member states on board. There are, of course, strict requirements on how you get to be included in the European Union or not. The European Union, I mean, you can say there are some similarities, but I wouldn't take it as an analog for the way in which the Indian Union should exist. So I don't think that model is particularly helpful.
Yeah. Now, I think you mentioned about federalism as being one of the arguments that being put out, but you want to focus on fraternity. But there's one striking thing about all conversations on delimitations that I find is that we are a bicameral legislature. The Rajya Sabha, the Council of State exists. And there's absolutely no conversation about how Rajya Sabha can be a possible solution for this delimitation problem. Is that and it was also not included in the legislative package of increasing the number of seats. Now, is this like the entire point of Rajya Sabha to balance out the state interests and where the states can find a voice at a national level? Can that idea be used for this delimitation issue?
I think there are people who have talked about Rajya Sabha. I think my former colleague Orgo at Vidhi and Vidhan Vaishnav, a lot of others have talked about the possibility. I am not so sure that we should reform the Rajya Sabha on its own merits to be a proper council of the states. Let's not include it in this package. And in fact, the reform of Rajya Sabha actually requires 2 very small but very impactful changes. Number one, limiting the definition of money bill very specifically. Right? Money bill has to only deal with taxation or spending. Any other provision which is included in the money bill has to be essential to the whole question of taxation or whatever spending. It cannot just be something tacked on like the Aadhaar and somebody declares it, that is also money. It can't depend on just the speaker's certification of the same. I hope the Supreme Court decides that in Roger Matthews soon. The second thing I think which the Rajya Sabha needs to enshrine constitutionally is to say that only a politician from that state should be allowed to stand for Rajya Sabha elections.
Yeah.
This whole idea that you can freely move, can not be domiciled in any one particular state to stand for Rajya Sabha, I think that has damaged this entire exercise very badly. You are no longer really a representative of the state unless you're effectively being put forward by a regionalist party like the DMK or the TDP or something like that. So I think to that extent, you need these two tweaks to make the Rajya Sabha a more effective council of states. I know there have been ideas about having more representation for all states in the Rajya Sabha. But see, that requires a more fundamental reworking of our multi-party system. And let's not go there because you don't want to fundamentally rewire something about the constitution with unknown effects. You want to make sure that what is worked is working, what has stopped working, you want to change it around to make sure that, and again, the original design was not wrong. The original design was that Rajya Sabha will be an effective check on temporary legislative majorities, that you will have to essentially convince more parties. And I think the failure of the Constitution Amendment Bill is a good example of how you need to take a large part of Parliament together to with you if you need to pass a Constitution Amendment Bill. It can't be one party wants. Yes, it could have been done perhaps in very brief circumstances. But I think either there was a majority, 2/3 majority in Lok Sabha and none in Rajya Sabha. The fact that you need 2/3 in both means that everybody has to agree that this is in national interest. This is not just my party's interest. So to that extent, I think let us not tamper too much with that. Let us make sure that the Rajya Sabha actually performs its role as a check to some extent on the Lok Sabha's powers. And to do that, I think we have to restore this norm that you have to be a domicile of that state to stand, like with the Lok Sabha elections, where you have to have a house in this particular constituency for a certain number of period of years before you're allowed to stand for elections in this particular area for this constituency. And make the money bill much more restrictive so that there is serious debate and serious strictures. See, beyond that, I, for one, I'm not fully. I used to think it used to be possible to gerrymander in India. I am less convinced that it is possible to do so. We may be able to do it for one or two constituencies here and there. You may not be able to do it at a large scale level. And to that extent, I think Amit Shah was right when he spoke on the floor of the House that you cannot fool the Indian voter. The Indian voter has a mind of her own. You may think you have her support from now to the end of eternity just because they voted for you 2 or 3 times, but she will change her mind and she will not sold on the idea that one party alone can represent. So I think any party which believes that it can gerrymander a majority in India, I think is completely deluded.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's strictly speaking possible to do it at a national level.
Yeah,
but that said,
wrong of any political.
and it's also that it's not so particularly tied so heavily, so hard that I will only vote for this. And people vote on everyday concerns. Sure, at certain points they may vote for certain other concerns, but by and large, in Indian elections, people vote on everyday concerns. On is the state working for me? Is the state doing what I wanted to? If it is doing so, you might succeed. If it is not, no amount of money, muscle, or careful redrawing will prevent. Right? And he gave a good example, an emergency when people felt that what was done was wrong, not just because at a very high theoretical principle level, but because they felt the brush or let's say the lathi of the Indian state too keenly. People voted against it. So let's trust the Indian voter, but let's also make sure that the rules of the game are fair and constitutional, which allows the Indian voter to express her desire from the government more clearly than ever.
Understood. Thank you so much for breaking down, starting from women's reservation, going into the history of it, how it has to be looked at as a matter of right and not accommodation, and then of course the big debate about delimitation, why it is important, why we need to broaden our understanding of what the North South debate looks like. And of course, the reform that you suggested of looking at the voters instead of a population for a large scale reform. Thank you so much for joining us for this very important and very recent topic. And I hope that this was helpful for anyone listening. Enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you for having me on the podcast, Arnav. My pleasure.
Thank you.